Hey, Holly, good to go.
Okay, great. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome everybody to our meeting this morning and call it to order. The time is now 9:01. Stephanie, will you please take attendance?
Good morning. Adrian Cochran. Adrian has not yet joined us. Andrea Comer.
Present. Good morning.
Good morning. Ellen McKitterick.
Present.
John Scott will not be joining us today. Mike Soltis
Present.
and Holly Williams.
Present.
All right, we have a quorum.
Thank you. And I'd like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Adrian's joining us now. Just wanted to acknowledge
Good morning.
Adrian.
Good morning. So I'd also like to take a moment to welcome and thank any members of the public who are going to join us this morning. And we're going to start with a review of our minutes from the March 24th, 2023 meeting. So I would like to ask the committee for a review of the March 24th, 2023 minutes and a call to approve.
Motion to approve the March 24th, 2023 meeting.
I'll second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, the motion carries. And our first substantive item is a review of the spending to date. So Dave, would you please provide us an update of the budget review to date?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Holly, and good morning, everybody. Okay.
Can see your screen, Dave.
Thank you for the verification, as always. Okay. So we are going to talk about the month of March this morning. And so for the month of March, the authority spent almost $964,000. And the primary expenses for that were $485,000 in salaries, pension, benefit expenses, $258,000 for contact center. We actually paid 2 months in the month of March, so it's twice as high as it normally is, and outreach expenses of $162,000. For the month of March, we were $216,000 better than budget. And year to date through March, we've spent $8.3 million, and we are currently about $5 million better than budget. For our bond funds, we spent almost $256,000. That was $31,000 more than we had spent for the month, but that's primarily a timing difference. Year to date, the bond funds that have been spent have been just about $1,279,000, and there's a positive variance there of $3.7 million. We do expect that variance to decrease over the rest of the fiscal year as the spending on the bonds continues. Most of that spending was budgeted earlier in the year. It's happening later in the year, so that's why the variance will decrease as we go on. In terms of bond money and how much we've used that's been allocated, we have $16 million of bond funds that's allocated. To date, we've spent just about $12.5 million, so there's $3.5 million left of the bond funds that have been allocated thus far. Moving on to the contribution budget. If teams will cooperate with me. There we go. Thank you, teams. Okay. Contribution budget. So our activity for the month of March was a negative $29.7 million compared to a budget of $38.4 million. That's a positive variance of a little over $8.6 million. The biggest driver of that was our benefit payments. We spent $30.6 million. That is larger than usual for a month, but that's because the authority reimbursed Aflac for 5 weeks of payments instead of 4. Even with the additional week, we were still ahead of budget by over $6.7 million. Our contributions were $641,000. That was about $463,000 less than we budgeted. But as is typically the case, it was more than offset by the investment income we're earning, which was almost $1.8 million, and that was also primarily the variance, as the interest rate we're earning on investment income is north of 4.5%, and we had budgeted 0.1% around this time last year. Year to date, our activity for the contributions has been $65 million. That's compared to a budget of a negative $45 million. So we are $110,000 ahead of budget for the year through March. And again, the largest driver of that is our benefit payments that are being paid out less than budgeted. Our contribution fund at the end of March was $448 million. From inception to date, the two biggest drivers of that are the contribution revenue coming in of $823 million and benefit claims being paid out, which to date are over $320 million. Our balance sheet is, we have over $471 million of assets. Again, the largest driver of that is our short-term investment fund account, which is at $435 million. One thing I did want to note that I actually should have noted on the last page is, as I had mentioned previously, our impressed account is earning interest now. It's earning interest at 3.5%. So the good news is it's not just sitting there doing nothing. It is earning interest now. So we're obviously pleased with that. Moving on to our year-end projections. We project that by the end of the year, our net activity will be $7.4 million compared to a budget of about $3 million. That leads a positive variance of $4.4 million. The two biggest drivers of that are, number one, salary and related positions started later than they were budgeted. And also this year, we spent less than we continue to anticipate to spend less on outside IT consulting expenses than we had budgeted throughout the year. And as far as the contribution budget goes, by the end of the year, we think we'll be at about $74.8 million of activity compared to a negative $54.7 million that we had budgeted. So that'll be a positive variance of over $129 million. And again, the biggest driver of that is we're paying out benefit payments less than we had budgeted earlier in the year. That's where we are right now through the month of March. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Next, we're going to discuss the bond repayment update. So Dave, if you'd like to take us through that, I know you've been working on that.
Okay, hello again. Okay, so we're going to talk about bond repayments. All right, let me bring that one up.
Can see your screen, Dave.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to do an update on bond repayments of the authority. So let's start with just a little background. a few years ago, back in 2019, I believe, the state had authorized $50 million in bond funds to the authority, $25 million each in the first 2 years of the authority's existence. These bond funds were intended for the authority's IT systems, and that included things such as the employee contribution system, benefit payments, benefit payment system, including a DOL system for the administration of appealing benefit payments, things of that nature. It's also written in the statutes that the authority is required to reimburse the bond funds. I'm told this is somewhat unique for the state of Connecticut. Normally, institutions, I shouldn't say institutions, but agencies and the like are not required to pay back bond funds, but we are. It's written in the statute. So we have been working with the Office of Policy and Management, who are also authorized in the statute, along with the Office of the Treasury, to determine how those bond funds are repaid. So in recent months, we've been working with them to finalize how that's done. We just got the latest version of the document last night, so I will be sending that to you after this meeting, but I wanted to go over with you what's in that document. It's only a one-pager. It's not that long. But I want to let everybody know what's happening in it. First of all, the amount that we have to repay back is $60 million. So as you know from my financial presentations, that's the amount that's allocated that we just went over. So that's the amount we would have to pay back. And again, we've spent that money. The largest items we spent on that so far that have been allocated are on the employee contribution system and the benefit claim system, including the appeal system, our share of the appeal system that DOL built. There's also some money for fund recovery, claim data integration, and website redesign that's allocated that we're currently building on. So what are the terms of the repayment? Well, let's start with the interest rate. The interest rate is 3.5%, and that's compounded semi-annually. And how did the Office of Policy and Management, which I'll abbreviate as OPM, determine that? They looked at the interest rates of the bonds that the state had during the time that the funds were originally allocated to the authority. And so based on that information, that's how they determined the 3.5%. The payment term is over 10 years. So the interest amount over that 10 years on the $16 million of allocated funds, which would be the principal, would be $3.1 million in total. So the amount of money that the authority would pay back in total would be over $19 million. The authority would have to pay each of those 10-year amounts annually by the end of its fiscal year, which is June 30. The annual payments for the first time would start the end of this fiscal year, and it would start out at $2.2 million. Over time, the amount goes down because there's less principal, so the amount of interest goes down. So by the 10th year, the annual amount that we'd have to pay would be $1.7 million. If the authority wanted to prepay a portion of the bond money that it owes, it could without penalty. It doesn't have to, but we do have that option if we decided. If the authority had any additional allocations beyond the, sorry, having volume issues here. If the authority had any additional allocations beyond the $16 million that's been allocated already, the OPM and OTT would determine a rate at that time that the authority would pay back, because those allocations would be after this one, and the rates will be different. So OPM would determine the rate at that time. If for some reason, in the unlikely event that the authority would be unable to make its annual payment prior to June 30, then it's required to notify OPM by June 1. At its discretion, OPM can determine a new schedule at that time. Specifically, the OPM secretary can determine a new payment schedule at that time. So in summary, that's what's going on. I will add that one of the reasons we're discussing this with you now is that we're going to bring this to the board at the next board meeting, and we are going to ask for a vote for them for approval to sign the document that we're signing along with OPM as to the payment terms. We just wanted to make sure that it was finalized and immortalized in a document, so everybody knew what the payment terms were going to be going forward. Does anyone have any questions regarding bond repayments?
I have a question.
Yes, Mike.
So we have the option to prepay, right?
Yes, sir.
And I'm thinking about one of your prior slides, which said for this year, our operating expenses are going to be about 13 million, which is about 7 million under budget. Is that correct?
For the operating budget, we were going to be better by $4.4 million
For the entire year?
for the entire fiscal year. Yes.
Well, what did I miss? Because I thought on your slide, it said total expenses for the year projected to be 13 million. And I know we have a budget of 20 million.
Well, the expense, that's the revenue side. The expense side is $17 million. Would it be helpful if I brought the slide,
Yes,
brought
yes.
it back up for you, Mike? Sure. Hold on a second. Okay. So we are projecting expenses of $12.6 million. The budget was almost $17.1 million. So the difference is $4.4 million. You're on mute, Mike. Mike, I can't, you're on mute, Mike. I
Sorry.
can't hear you. Oh, okay. Thank you.
So I thought the administrative budget for this year was 20 million. It's 17?
The revenue, well, the administrative revenue is $20 million. That's the fee coming in. That's what we
Okay.
budgeted. And then the expenses that we budgeted against that fee are $17 million. So the net amount that we budgeted was just over $2.9 million.
Okay, but our actual projections through the end of the year for expenses
Yes.
are 12.6.
Yes.
So say 13.
Okay. Yes.
So in my simple math, I start with a budget of 20.
Right.
I subtract 13.
Right.
I have 7 million left.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Yes. Yes. Correct.
So one option for us is to take some of that money. I know we have to make a payment by the end of this fiscal year,
Right.
but an option is to make a greater payment than we're required to make.
Yeah, oh, yes, that is certainly an option. Yes.
So what is that an option? It seems to me that's an option we ought to consider. I don't know what considerations go into whether that's a good idea or not. But it seems to me that's an issue we should be deciding at some point.
Yes, and I absolutely agree. So I don't think I would do it the first year out. We're still early in the game in terms of benefit payments going out. So we wouldn't, my concern was and would be, I wouldn't want to make a payment on the bonds and then potentially not have money in the fund to pay benefits until I have some more history behind me of what the benefit payments look like. If things keep trending, if they were trending the way they are now, then yes, we could absolutely seriously consider making a bond payment early, and then we'd pay it that much sooner and pay less interest. But I wouldn't necessarily do it at this juncture.
Okay, so you would suggest we revisit it when?
No less than annually.
So next year about this time.
Right.
It seems to me it's to the authority's advantage to pay this off diligently and in advance if possible.
I completely agree, but I'm always cautious, Mike, and I want to make sure we have all our ducks in a row and we really have a solid footing and foundation of what the trends look like going forward. I think we need a little more history of benefit payments before we decide to do that.
Okay, can we make sure and put that on the agenda every, this time of year so that
for sure.
we
Oh,
don't
yes.
miss that opportunity to make a decision?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dave, sorry, but even though we make the payments in June, is that the only time we could make a payment if we wanted to?
Oh,
This
no.
might be a question for Holly. Like, could we make a payment just mid-year if we felt that that was appropriate?
So there's nothing in my read or understanding from the draft letter that precludes you from making an additional payment towards the outstanding debt. I think that's, within your latitude should you have the resources. If for you could ask for the letter to be revised to stipulate to that specifically. It doesn't seem as though that would be necessary. I think an alternative could be, as opposed to having the letter revised, to simply reach back out to the OPM capital team and get confirmation of that. I can't speak on their behalf, but like I said, there's nothing in the letter that precludes an additional payment. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I think I agree with Dave that even though we absolutely want to pay diligently, and that's why we kind of push to get this started. Once we pay the money back to the bonds, it's gone. There's sort of no pulling it back, and there's the bond money can only be accessed for specific purposes like IT. So it's just we really will be very cautious about committing that money, committing more than the obligated amount to repayment, and while we're still kind of figuring out our trend lines.
And if I may, I'm all on board with that, but here's what I'm looking at, and this will come up later when we talk about the budget. So we're about 35% under budget on our, well, let me back up. When I look at the budget, I think about it in three parts, right? Two of the parts we don't have much control over, the contributions and the claims. I mean, around the edges, we have some control, but not really.
Mhm.
The only thing we have control over are our administrative costs. So that's kind of what I focused on.
Mhm.
And projected year end, our administrative costs are going to be 35% below budget. Okay, and that's the numbers Dave and I just went to. Budgeted 20 million, projected total expenses 13 from 20 is 7, rough numbers. So my simple mind asks, there's a lot there. Doesn't make any sense to, what do we do with that money? We could do nothing with it, or does it make any sense? And we have to pay a couple million out of that for our first payment. I understand that. So that leaves us roughly 5 million in our budget. Doesn't make any sense to make an additional payment. That's kind of how my logic, or illogic as the case may be, went.
Absolutely. I guess I think where we are is right now that money is making interest for us, and it is available to us essentially for the reserves for the claims. So if we're making more money in interest, and it kind of can help give us a little bit more of a security cushion on the claim side, and the interest rate that we're getting on that money, thanks to the treasurer's office, is greater than the 3.5% that we owe on the bond money. Do we want, at this specific time in our kind of early stage of our claims journey, do we want to put more than the required amount into paying off that debt? So I think it's not sitting there doing nothing, it's making us money.
And forgive this question if this sounds so our excess administrative fee, or our excess over budget or below budget, is a hedge for claims? I'm not quite sure I'm connecting how those
well,
two connect.
I guess the way I'm thinking of it is there's a pool of money that's living in the trust fund, earning interest. We take a draw from that for our administrative costs. We don't have to draw as much. So even if we have an administrative budget, it's not like we pull it all out right away. So we're trying to keep our administrative costs low so that we don't, because that's the prudent thing to do, so that we be able to allow more money to be used for claims if necessary. So it's not as much a hedge as it is taking a lower draw.
Okay,
And actually,
I understand that.
okay. And
Okay.
actually, Mike, you'll see that next month. I'm jumping the gun on a financial statement presentation, but because we're better than budget right now, normally we take a draw at the beginning of the quarter of $5 million. Well, we decided not to do that this quarter because we had enough money in the operating funds. So why have it sitting there doing nothing when it could be earning interest in the contribution fund? And so we have that option to do that. So we kept it there. I mean, if we need the money, we can take it out at a later date because it's been budgeted. But if we don't need it, then we're not just going to take it to take it. I mean, especially because we're in a year and a half ago when interest rates were almost nothing. you know, it may not have mattered as much, but now that we're in a rising interest rate environment, it does matter. So we're more sensitive and more cognizant of when we need to take that money out and when. I think I just said the same thing twice, of taking out the money and when we need to take it out and determining why.
All right. Okay, I got it. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
I don't see any. All right, so Dave, you're still in the hot seat. We're gonna move on and discuss the draft budget for the 2023-2024 fiscal year.
Okay, I prefer the term active speaker, but okay.
Okay, well, I'll adopt that language, active.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's talk about the budget for next year. So we went over the budget last month, and so this month going to go over some updates we've had on the budget since then, and address a question or two that came up last time. Okay, make sure I find the right document now. Okay, here we go.
You can see your screen, Dave.
Thank you for the confirmation, Stephanie. Oh, here we go. Oh, already went too far ahead. Okay, so here is our update on our budget for fiscal year 2023 to 2024. Okay, so we made a couple of updates to two parts of the budget. One was the operating budget, and the other was the contribution budget. The bond budget stayed exactly the same. And actually, the operating budget didn't change all that much either. So let's talk about what those changes were. So for the operating budget, there's $9,000 of additional expenses. The biggest driver of that was internally, we determined that we were going to need some additional users for some existing software licenses, and that was going to cost $9,000. We also had some smaller adjustments for subscriptions and payroll and related expenses and some rounding we did. But at the end of the day, it was going to be an additional $9,000 of expenses that we budgeted. So in total, our amount is the revenue part is still the same at 20 million. The expenses are now 17 million, almost $291,000, which leaves $2.7 million for the operating reserves. Moving on to bond funds. Like I said, bond funds are exactly the same. So we've budgeted $2.1 million for an additional allocation that will be for enhancements to the portal and the employee contribution system, and also for the automation of the administration of private plan renewals, which will be happening now that we have private plans, and after 3 years they have to be renewed. So we want to automate that systematically. Moving on to the contribution budget, the one change we made to it was regarding the bond repayments. At the last version of the budget, we had budgeted the bond repayments at 4%. That was based on the best information we had at the time. As you might remember from my previous presentation, the interest rate is at 3.5%. So we adjusted the budget for that, and that created an additional $79,000 into the contribution budget. That also had a small effect on the investment income of $2,000. So the total effect to the contribution budget, was $81,000. So this is what the contribution budget looks like now. There had been a question at the last meeting of, did the budget include had to take it into consideration the effects of a recession. And we touched base with our actuaries. Excuse me, I apologize. So we did touch base with our actuaries, who we had been working with very closely in determining the significant parts of this budget, the contribution side and the benefit side in particular. And they had considered the possibility of a recession in their numbers. So there was nothing additional that we had to do for our budget, as it had already been part of the equation. So at the end of the day, the contribution budget is here where it stands. We're budgeting about an approximate $13 million of positive activity over the year. So what do we have to do next for the budget? Well, first we'll answer any questions you have, but our goal today is to finalize the budget with you. And then we will review the budget with the board and ask them to vote on it at the next board meeting on Thursday, May 11th. If they feel more time is needed, we'll ask them for a special meeting by May 31st because our plan of operations requires it to be done by May 31st. Or if the board so decides, they could vote to have the budget vote at the next board meeting on June 8th. So those are our updates to the budget. Does anyone have any questions?
May I?
Mike, of course, Mike, the answer is always yes.
Sorry. And again, I don't want any of my questions to be interpreted to mean I have any doubts about the administration of the authority. I think it's terrific. I think you got great staff. I think you're very efficient. And so please, the only reason I focused on that was, again, we have no control or little over contributions, little over claims. So, you know, what can I focus on, right? But my only observation, and I think the prior discussion took care of it, was, you know, we're so far under budget this fiscal year, 35% projected, and we have the same budgeted amount for next fiscal year. So having been involved in budgets in the past, I realize it's an art and not a science, but at some point, if budgets aren't realistic, they're useless. And so my initial question was, is that 20 million realistic? Do we really need 20 million to operate the authority? We're running it on 13 million this year, add in some bond fund repayments. That brings us to 15 million and change. Are we just, you know, I don't want to use excessive in what we're allocating for the authority's operation? But the prior discussion about using discretion to whether to draw down money we need, the fact that we're in the early stages still of the administration of the authority, and the fact that we're our administrative costs are less than 4% of our contributions, which I try to keep an eye on other agencies around the country, and which I think is very, very much in the range. In fact, I think it's on the low range. So all of that has assuaged my question about the $20 million in the budget for the administrative cost.
Thank you. And please, Mike, and all of you, please never, ever hesitate to ask probing questions. That's exactly why we need you to be here and to really push and to help us and to challenge us and to help us refine our thinking. I'm glad the prior discussion helped address it. And I think part of what we are planning for is that we know we're going to add not a whole lot more staff, but we do have some more positions to fill. We know that there are contractually agreed upon raises that OPM has already established for the state, so that that affects us. And hard to believe, but we're coming in on, well, technically it'll be 4 years in the fall since we actually started. So there's going to be some laptop refreshment and just things that we haven't had to do that, or that we haven't spent for a few years, that we're going to be coming up and spending on this coming year. We're not going to go crazy on spending. We're going to keep a really close eye on our costs and try to make sure that we continue to live as leanly as we possibly can. And we really do appreciate the mindfulness that you bring to this process, because that's why we value so much.
I don't have any further questions.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions?
Maybe I do have one. What's the process here? Do we need to make a recommendation to the board, or a consensus, or nothing?
You're sort of our dress rehearsal and out of town tryout, right? So this gives us the chance to really address those questions, make sure that we refine what needs to be refined. So you don't technically need a vote or on anything at the board meeting. If you feel so inclined to share your feelings as to whether the budget is appropriate, or to express, the concerns that you have that are now assuaged, that would be great. But we don't formally need a recommendation from this committee to move forward.
It just seems, Dave, when he presents the budget to the board, that it would be helpful to be able to say, presented it to our committee, and there was a favorable consensus, something, assuming
Absolutely.
that's the case.
Oh, that's my first line, Mike.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to go in there cold and say, hey, we're showing it to you the first time, and the finance and audit committee is seeing it.
Yeah.
So we would say it has been reviewed by the finance committee, and there was, I like your wording actually, and there was a favorable consensus towards it.
Okay.
So yes, absolutely, we would absolutely let them know that.
Okay. Sorry, I was going very just legal technical on you, which was, there's nothing in our bylaws that require a formal motion by the committee. It's always helpful to be able to you put it this way: if you all hated it, we wouldn't be going to the board with it in 2 weeks.
But I think, to Mike's point, if you kind of lead with the fact that there was considerable conversation around a couple of themes here, sometimes for boards, because everybody else doesn't have, or everyone doesn't have that finance, thought process and understanding of. I think it's helpful if he thought of some of these things, someone else is likely thinking of them. If you lead with perhaps mentioning that has been discussed and what the conclusion was, I think that's helpful. Because I agree with you, no legal requirement, but sometimes these committees exist for exactly the reason of what is happening now, and to show that it's robust and not just and not really a rubber stamp, because we're not stamping anything, but there was conversation, questions were raised, and here were the responses.
I didn't realize I was on mute. I was saying absolutely, and both Dave and I are making a note of that right now.
Thank you. Appreciate the feedback, Adrian.
Any other questions? Don't see any. All right, so is there any old business that anybody would like to discuss?
If I may ask just a quick question, is there any update on that 1179 legislation?
Nothing yet. We're in the 5 weeks, 3 days until the end of session, I think. So this is where they actually start going into session every week. So I think the Labor Committee Chair had indicated a hope to try and get it raised in the Senate sometime sooner rather than later, so it doesn't end up on the calendar on the last day, but nothing formal.
Any other old business? No. Any new business anybody would like to discuss? Nope. All right, well, may I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, the motion carries and the meeting is adjourned now at 9:47 a.m. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
You as well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Andrea.
Bye.